Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's right at the top of the hour and people are still trickling in. I think that we'll go ahead and get started anyways. We have a lot of interesting information to cover, and with that, welcome. Today's Lunch and Learn series session will be SyteLine Admin Training Part 1. We will be holding a Part 2 that will either be happening in July or August. That is to be determined. Today's presenters are Jesse Floyd and Tim McManus. And before we get started, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping items. Everyone's lines will be muted, so if you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A. That way we can try and get answers back to you either in the chat or live for everyone to hear. The session will be recorded and made available in the Learning Center on our website after the presentation. And I think that about covers it. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jesse to begin the presentation. Jesse?
All right, thank you, Heather. Well, good morning, afternoon, for wherever you're located. Welcome. My name is Jesse Floyd. I'm one of the developers here at AIT. Today we're going to be covering a wide range of subjects, all focused on how to better maintain and manage your SyteLine system. Here's a quick breakdown of the topics of discussion today. We're going to take a look at a few areas of the system you may already be familiar with, such as printer setup and configuration, and hopefully perhaps a few that you're new to as well, such as how to set up and manage an audit log and what to do after a system crash. So we have a lot of ground to cover today, so let's not waste any more time and jump right in with our first topic, printer setup and configuration. So one quick caveat that I do want to provide is some of this information is applicable to both on-premise and SaaS customers in the cloud. However, the points about configuration items on the server is specific to those of you with an on-premise system. So before users can print or preview reports, it's necessary to perform the following setup tasks. First, you need to confirm the printer is a valid network printer. Next, you need to configure that printer on the utility server. It's recommended that printers be installed on the utility or app server or whichever server your Taskman service is running. Then, define your report options for those reports which should always go to a printer, and we'll cover report options a little more later. Now, if you're reading help files or documentation, you will most likely see that creating your printer records in SyteLine should follow a UNC naming convention. That is / name of your server / printer name. Although this is not required by the system, it's still good practice. However, if you have your printers configured on the utility or app server, you can simply enter your printer records with just the printer name, as you can see in the screenshot here with this printer called test. The top one follows the UNC path and that bottom one does not. We've noticed here lately that this oftentimes boosts performance in regards to print time if you simply enter the printer name here in this form. So speaking of cloud stuff,
you might go back up a little bit on that prior slide. Yeah, so one other thing about that is what we have found is having the actual printer installed on the utility server, even if it's, a printer out there on some other server, if you can install it locally on the utility server and not point to a different server, that saves you a world of trouble sometimes.
Right. Thank you, Tim.
Well, since I'm talking, just one thing, Jesse mentioned that some of these things are, easier said than done on, an on-premises or a hosted cloud versus multi-tenant SaaS. There are still some issues with, printing if you're in the cloud, direct printing, and, a couple of the partners and some others have come up with some alternatives. And real quick, this is something that we've developed, our cloud output manager, which essentially will allow you to print without having to go through a whole lot of gymnastics. In addition to it, though, as an alternative to, doing the Mongoose form changes, you actually can create some of your own documents or modify your documents, design them in Word, Microsoft Word, and basically have that as a design tool. When it goes through the output manager, you can, print that way, or you can create PDFs and store them or email them to do that. This also has the ability to manage bartender labels. And in some cases, we can actually create labels with this using Word, but there are some restrictions on, zebra things on that. But if you want to find out more about this, just shoot us a note, either in the chat or, afterwards when Heather gives you the contact email. So thanks, Jesse.
All right, thank you, Tim. So moving along, let's take a look at report options setup. So the report options form allows you to create in the system what are essentially output profiles for your reports. Within this form, you can set task and or user specific profiles in addition to global profiles. These records will control how the system ultimately delivers your reports to you. You can choose options such as the desired output format and receive your reports in several different file types, such as a PDF or an Excel, or send them directly to a printer, as we mentioned before. If you would like these reports sent to your inbox or displayed in real time, you have that capability available to you via the options for email notification, attach report, and auto view. Now that we see how to set up a report option, please note that SyteLine will follow a simple hierarchy for delivering tasks. First, it's going to look for records that have a task name defined and a user defined. Next, it's going to look for records that have your user defined and no task defined. This will be what we could call a blanket user option, in that all of your tasks will use this configuration when there is no specific task record found. Third, the system will look at records that have a task name defined but no user. These are what we could call global options that would apply to all users in the system. Then we have records with no task name and no user. And lastly, the system will default to the intranet values seen here for formatting. On the sites and entities form, or just the sites form, depending on your version, you can also set the default report output folder as a global option for sending your reports to a specific directory. Of course, any report options record that also has an output directory defined would override this value. Within this report output directory, your Taskman service looks for a user-specific subfolder. If not found, it's going to create that subfolder and it's going to direct its report output into that folder. The user-specific subfolders are used only if the report output obfuscation process default is set to 0, and we're going to cover process defaults in a little more depth later. I don't know if there's any questions yet. I'll just pause here for just a second before we move on and kind of switch gears.
I don't see any other questions currently. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So let's change it up here from setup and configuration stuff, and we'll take a look at a few common issues you may encounter when dealing with reports. First, let's take a look at what to do with a task or report that is running too long. So I would like to note that some financial reports and tasks oftentimes do run for a longer period than most others, especially around a month-end close. So depending on how long you've been managing the system, you will probably already have an idea about which reports run long and which reports do not. But to better aid you in this analysis, you can go to the form called Background Task History, as seen here. You'll be presented with useful information that will help you determine if a report is running abnormally and what your next steps are. So you can identify the user who submitted the report and inquire about it. The parameter set they chose may be large or potentially submitted in error. And on the far right, under status information, you can see submitted, started, and completed times. If the task is submitted but not started, this typically indicates an issue with the Taskman service, in which case a restart of this service will get your reports moving again. After reviewing all the information, if you've determined the report does need to be stopped, you can find the matching process ID via the task manager on the utility server and end it there. It should match with this process ID that you see here on the background task history form. So another note, just FYI, any task that is ended prematurely will receive a return status of failed. This one has a return status of succeeded. So you'll see failed up here and then an associated error on the record. So just if you're looking back at stuff, you'll see those things. That's how they'll display in the form for you. Now, reports printed in error is another common situation you may find yourself in. How to deal with a large set of reports that need to be stopped. If a user has submitted a report and ran it wide open by mistake, you'll have many records executing and printing nonstop. In this case, we can altogether skip the analysis steps of determining what to do with the task, since we already know this is an error and needs to be corrected. I'll encourage you to act fast and take the following actions to help take control of the situation. First, if your reports are going to a printer and wasting paper, you can simply turn the printer off or pause the printer queue on the server. Next, you can elect to stop the taskman service to prevent new tasks from being created. I would also like to make note that this will affect all other tasks or reports that are running at the time. So you can make that decision on a case-by-case basis. With the printer and the taskman service stopped, you can now proceed to clean up any of these active background task records that are still in a waiting status. Clear your printer queue, printer back on, it should be good to go. Yes, Tim?
So just question came in terms of, when you've got an environment that has a lot of processes, can you actually split this up into different servers? And the answer is, yeah, you can actually have a couple different taskmans running on different servers if you've got a big load. And that'll probably be covered in our system admin part 2, how to set that up, but that is definitely possible.
Yeah, definitely possible. And with the intranets form, you definitely point to the right location for your taskman service. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, the server where you have your apps or other things. So good question. So talking about background tasks, let's take a look at the background tasks and setting things up to run on a background queue. So many utilities, reports, and some activities can be scheduled to run daily, weekly, or monthly. You may want to or need to schedule some process to run at certain times of the day and at regular intervals. You can use the following forms to manage those processes. They include the background queue as seen here, active background tasks, and background task history, which we've already taken a look at. So one thing to note is the requirement for using the background queue is the reporter utility must have the background option as part of its action menu. And with your chosen reporter utility open, simply click the actions drop down on the top of your toolbar. You can click background. Alternatively, you can right click in the form to pull up the actions menu as well. The background queue form will then open, and from here, you can set your frequency and task schedule. So I'd actually like to take a minute to go ahead and walk through this process. So you should be able to see the SyteLine application pulled up. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go and set up a utility called Change CO Status Utility. We're going to set this thing up on a queue. So we can click the actions drop down. Background is there. You can also click in the form. If you click it in the right spot, you'll pull up the actions menu as well. So I can select background, and when this form pulls up, you can see some options here for setting your frequency and schedule. So for this particular utility, it's something I may want to run on, let's say, a daily basis. Once I select my recurrence, we're going to see some of these options change. So since I'm saying run it on a daily basis, run it every 1 day, we're going to run it at maybe an early time in the morning, say 5 a.m. And we're going to start it on tomorrow's date and give it no end date. So we want it to run just indefinitely. And click OK. Now if we go out to the active background tasks form, we'll see our new utility in a waiting status. So once this start date and time criteria is met, Taskman is going to pick up this utility and run it. And we can see all of our options here, and these things can be changed. Also, if you need to redo the schedule or the occurrence, you can delete this task from active background tasks since it is in a waiting status, which I think is one of the few statuses you can actually remove things from in this form.
Question came in. So back on that CO status change utility form, so probably assuming whatever parameters I put in there on this form or anything gets passed to that background, which is yes. And the other thing is, if there is a date, does that date, how does that date kind of go forward or change?
If the date goes forward or change, you would need to make sure you definitely tick this increment date flag here to make sure that we manage that properly.
So if I did it like for today's orders and then I increment the date, every day that it runs, it's going to increment and be quote unquote today's orders on the day it runs.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. One other thing to note, I'm gonna hop back over to the slides here. There's a multitude of these background tasks that you can run. You can schedule these things to run certain times of day, certain days of the week, and oftentimes you may find yourself having things running on the same day. In that particular situation, I would ask you to be mindful to stagger the starting times of these as to not overload your system with long-running utilities. And here's a sample list of some of the more common utilities you can schedule in the background queue. In addition to this list, we have a list of recommended background tasks to be running in your system. That is available for those of you who are interested. You can contact us after this presentation to get a copy of that. All right. Moving along to crash recovery. So I want to mention this portion of the presentation is specifically for what to do on the front end client side after recovering from a crash. This is assuming you have already performed any database recovery that may be required. So we're strictly looking at what to do on the front end of the SyteLine application. So to get everything working properly again in the event of a system crash, you may have to do any or all of the following: unlock any locked functions, any locked journals, and clean up any orphan sessions to help free up licenses. You'll see here on the screen, this crash recovery utility will perform all of these functions simultaneously. You do have the option to go to each of these forms separately. And that case may be if you have a specific user that has experienced a local crash due to a power outage or a battery that's died maybe on their computer, something like that. It may be easier for you then to go in and perform these actions individually instead of system-wide. So the last thing that I would probably recommend for crash recovery is after you have come in here, cleaned up sessions and done all of these things, is to test running a report to see if you may need to restart the Taskman service or not. These are some of the other forms just mentioned, unlocking locked journals or functions. I would like to note here, you have a little bit of information provided in these forms, and it lets you know why some of these functions or journals may be locked. The most common reason is actually in use at the time. You can't have more than one person at a time accessing a journal or performing a certain function. And then on the far right, we see here the session management form, which some of you may be familiar with. You can view and manage the currently connected sessions.
And sessions means users typically. Right?
Users typically that are connected to the system. You might see some sessions in here with a $ in the front. Those are typically your like system connections, those are really going to be for Taskman. So those we would recommend you not touch or end prematurely. You may be closing out a task that's running or a process that's running in the background.
And there's also, I believe, so you got that session type full client. If you're using the Excel add-in or the the Outlook, the Microsoft Office add-ins, or doing some sort of kind of REST API connection, that's going to be, I believe it's an automation type of thing. So you can have those sessions that are out there as well.
All right. Moving along to audit logging. This is a pretty robust piece here in the system that we'll talk about. Really, if you're experiencing any issues with data integrity in your system and you want some traceability to help you track down some of these problems, you can use the built-in audit log feature of SyteLine. I would caution you that you can get very granular with your audit log setup. So in the interest of time here, we'll keep it pretty short and simple. I will do a demonstration of the audit log. The following forms, though, are used to manage these audit logs. You can see here process defaults, which we've going to take another look at here a little bit later. We also have the audit log types form, the audit log form itself, and then delete audit logs, which will help you clean up some of these records in here. So another quick caveat, setting up your custom audit log types does require some working knowledge of the database table schema. So to aid you in finding table and field names, you can run the database schema report if you do not have ready access to SQL Management Studio, or if you are a customer that's in the cloud. So with that, I'm going to jump back over to the server, and we're going to just walk through setting up one of these things, and we can see how it works. So the first thing to do is to come into audit log types. When you open this form for the first time, you'll notice we have these records in here that are a category of system. These are going to be in here by default. They cannot be altered or modified in any way. So anytime you want to turn on audit logging, you're going to get these audit log types turned on by default as well. When you come in here to create a custom audit log type, you will have to set it up with a message type value of 10,000 or greater. I've come in here and already set this one up. This is a category of type database. You also have some options in here for custom form event. System is in the list, but you can't really add a system audit log type, so I would just ignore that one. Next, you would input your table that you're going to be auditing. In this case, I'm going to be taking a look at the customer order lines table, which is CO item. And specifically, I want to monitor the due date field on this particular form. This situation may be you have these due dates that are changing. Somebody's coming in and post-dating these things, and it's maybe messing up planning or some other type of situation. That's just going to be the scenario we're going to cover here today. Another common one may be monitoring some of your item master fields if people are changing, your sources and stuff like that. Again, you can get pretty granular with what you're logging in here. So with this one already turned on, with this audit log top already defined, I'm going to go out to the process defaults form, and we're actually going to need to turn this on. Again, we're going to talk about process defaults in a little more depth further into the presentation. So I will cover some of these other options you see here in this list. But for this demonstration, we are really focused with record number 9, which is enable audit logging. So we can see the value right now is set to 0. I'm going to turn this to 1, which is going to turn it on, and I'm going to save. Okay, I'm going to close this form. And just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to go to audit log form, and we can see here with turning the filter off, I've got no records in this log right now, so nothing's actually being monitored. Now that I've turned on the process defaults, I am going to need to log out of the system and back in. You could possibly refresh your local cache and might do the same thing, but I'm just going to relog out and get back into the system, which should make these changes take effect. So right now, with process defaults turned on for audit logging, we are already capturing data. So what I'm going to do is go actually into customer order lines form. I'm going to select an order and we're going to make a change to the due date and then take a look at the audit log to see what has been captured. So I know this being a demo environment, we're probably not going to have stuff that's quite up to date. So I'm just going to take the top one in the list here, and we can see the due date on this customer order line is set to a date of 5/11/2020. So we're already in the past. So I'm just going to backdate this thing a little further back and say, well, this thing should actually be due on the 6th. Move up the timeline a little bit. We're going to save. All right. Now I'm going to open the audit log form and let's take a look what we have in here. So before it's empty, now we can see we have some data in here. So the system has captured the fact that we have logged into the system. This is message type 1. After logging in, we opened the form, customer order lines. Then we went into the customer order lines form, and now we're into our custom audit log type here, type 10,000. And we can see that we made a change to that. It's got the primary key of the order number and line and the site. And we had an original value, which they call old value here, of 5/11/2020. We made a change, saved it to our new value of May 6th, 2020. We can see the user that performed this change and the date and time that this change occurred. So that is a quick demonstration of how audit log functions. Again, if I was to go in and open any other type of form, let's just open up, let's say process defaults, open up that form. You can open up active background tasks. Not making any changes in here. CO status change utility can come back out to audit log, and we're going to see even more records in there because I've went and opened up all these other forms. So
just want to kind of point out a couple things about this. There's a virtual, treasure chest of data that you can get in here, but it's actually not all that easy to get out, and sometimes it's not. There's a little bit of kind of requirement to know the data structure and things when you're setting these things up. So CO item underscore mass, that's the SQL table. The SQL table is accessed through kind of the IDO layer. So you got to kind of know a little bit about that. And if you don't know, there's a way to actually go out and, look at on the form. You can see what the IDO property is, and you can go into the IDO properties form and see how that's bound to what data table. So there's a way to do that, setting it up. But on the side of getting data out, that's a nice report, but it's, if I really wanted to kind of filter that and go through some things, and what we've done before is to create data views that actually look at this. The thing that we had to do with data views on this, and this is kind of getting a little more in the weeds, is you actually, for data views, you need kind of some, I forget what it was. We needed to create a SQL view because of to get to the row pointer and things like that, so that it would work on the data view. If anyone's interested in how we did that, send us a note and we'll get that to you. But yeah, it's super useful, but you need a little bit of kind of knowledge of the data schema or how to get to it, and some reporting tools on the way out. And we got a question, how can we delete audit information after X number of months or periodically, automatically?
All right, so that's a good question. I was actually about to segue into that because as we can see here, if we have audit logging turned on and because we can't disable these system audit log types for opening forms, if you have a pretty large user base, this is going to be a mountain of data you're going to find yourself having very, very quickly the longer that you have your audit logging turned on. It becomes pretty crucial for you to do periodic purging, whatever your retention policy is, whether it's 60 days, 90 days, whatever have you. It'd be pretty important for you to also include periodic purging of these logs or to simply not keep the audit log turned on all the time. So you have a couple of ways to do that. The first one here is inside the audit log form itself, we can actually mark this log for deletion. Click that button, it's going to highlight all these records, and if we save, then they're all going to be gone. The other option that we can do is via a form that I mentioned in the slide, which is called Delete Audit Logs, which is a utility that you can run, maybe even set up on the background queue to come in here and delete these audit logs, and you can even specify the certain type. If you wanted to delete those system type audit logs, you really don't care about seeing every time somebody logged in or opened a form. You can purge those and kind of get really specific with cleanup of these audit logs because, again, I emphasize the fact that depending on how large of a system you have, even if you don't have a large system, that table is going to fill up pretty quick, and it's going to eat up a lot of precious disk space. So it's very crucial you clean these things up. Don't turn it on and forget about it.
Good point. And I guess, if you did want to keep some of this and not really have it in the SyteLine database, we've got the ability here, if you're a cloud customer, multi-tenant SaaS, is to push this out to the data lake. And the data lake has a whole lot more storage space that's not kind of in the middle of your database.
Yep, lots of different ways you can choose to retain this information if you choose so. So I'm going to go ahead and just clean these up. And I'm going to go back out to process defaults before I forget and go ahead and turn this off. So again, 1 is on, 0 is off. So turn it to 0 and save. So I'm going to get a little out of order with continuing to talk about process defaults. So before I jump back into a more in-depth look at that, let me go back and reference the slides, and we're going to be taking a look at some other useful utilities and forms for administering your system. Next up, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Synchronized Next Keys utility. So for context, the application database includes a table called Next Keys that stores the last value that's used for any alphanumeric keys whose system-generated value can have a prefix. And these are going to be things like your customer order number, your purchase order number, or job number. So for example, your customer orders could include a prefix such as CO or SO, and then the number, or dash and then the number. So the value in Next Keys, the table, is going to be incremented each time to determine the next system-generated value for that key. And occasionally, this sequence does get out of whack for a variety of reasons, typically maybe a system crash or somebody just improperly closing their client. So to kind of combat that and mitigate the damage here, keep these values in sync, this is a helpful utility you can run periodically to keep these things in order. So I'm going to do another quick demonstration of that just for visual aid. We're going to go back into customer orders and just simulate what this kind of looks like. All right, and here in the list on the left, you can see we've got a number of different order numbers of various prefixes. So if I open up the Synchronized Next Keys form, that will be evident as well. There's a bunch of different types in here. So to get specific with this, I'm just gonna filter on custom order to make it a little easier to see for everybody. So in this list, we've got a couple dozen here, different prefixes. So the one that I am looking at right now is this WB prefix customer order. We can see the last value that the next keys table actually has is the current one, which is WB1. Meaning when I come in here to create a new order, the next one in the sequence should be 2. So if I create a new record in here, I'm going to use this same prefix WB with the question mark to get the next one in the order. Just going to choose the top customer and save. Then we're going to get WB0002 because that's the next one in the sequence. If we refresh this form, we would see that change take place almost immediately. So what happens if we have somebody that is not, using the right prefix, or they just decide to key in the next value instead of letting the system generate this this value? This could look something like, okay, WB, it's going to be, 3 or 2, but I'm going to type like 3,000 or 30,000 instead and save after we choose a customer, of course. And now we're officially out of sequence from what we were at before. If I refresh Synchronized next keys, we can see that change now. So instead of going from 1, 2, 3, we are now 1, 2, 3,000. Okay, and we don't want that to happen. We want to get back to the order we were at. So a couple things you can do if you act fast enough. I know sometimes these types of issues aren't really highlighted until sometimes it's too late, and you have to make a decision and pivot and just decide, okay, we're gonna run with this sequence now. We're cleaning up best we can. If we were to come in here and nothing else has really been done on this customer order, I mean, at this point, we don't have any lines associated with it, so we can feel pretty confident to go ahead and get rid of this thing and get back on the sequence that we should be. So if I simply come in here and just delete this thing outright, it's going to be removed from our customer order table. Everything's going to kind of flow through the database and eventually make its way to next keys. And we're going to see this sequence get changed right now. So we're back to WB2. So if we came in here to create the next order and we didn't key stuff in, we let the system handle the numbering, then we would be right back where we started in proper sequence. Now, it's not always that clean to come in here and just remove it and it immediately gets reset, which is the reason for this utility. So it would be best practice to come in here, clean up any orders or purchase order numbers, anything that's kind of out of sync, run this utility to make sure that the table does get resequenced properly. No questions or anything about that?
Not at this time.
All right, cool. Let's take a look now at another useful form. We've talked a lot about some of these different utilities and forms that are going to kind of help you with administrating the system. You will find that there is a one-stop shop form for a lot of different areas of the system and for a particular user of the system. And that also includes system administration. So much like your buyer home, controller home, or executive home pages, you do have this system administrator kind of launching page that has some shortcuts and links to several useful forms, some of which we've already discussed here. So it'd be kind of handy, you want to have that as like a shortcut or maybe something that launches as soon as you come in and open the client for the first time. That way you kind of have ready access to a lot of these different forms pretty quickly. You can take a look at what else is available on that form. There are also some, not sure if there's any KPI stuff. I know there's some statistic stuff on there that some of you may find useful. Some things about the statistics of the database and background tasks, how long things typically run. Some of these are going to pull in like a lot of information, so I'm not going to click on DB statistics because it would just sit here and spin for a minute or so until it pulls in all that information. But you can see some things like, what are kind of the average run times of certain tasks and how many times they've been run and so forth. So some useful information here if you want to take advantage of some of this stuff in this system administrator homepage.
And I think the DB statistics, you're right, it runs for a while, but it does give you some information about kind of like indexing where you want to re-index things, and it can show you just a little bit about kind of where your overhead is.
Yep, pretty cool. Let me just click it and see how long it runs. This being a demo environment, it may not run as long as I typically expect or would see in other places. So we'll let that run for a second. We're going to be moving on to talk a little bit more about process defaults, go back and revisit that subject. So let me just give this a second to run and maybe we can take a look at that before we move forward.
It might be quick. If I was actually doing a demo, it would probably take an hour.
Hopefully not. It feels like just staring at the screen, it's time's going a lot slower than it actually is. So.
But we've used this sometimes when customers are having certain problems in areas like it's slow in APS or whatever. It'll go through and it'll give you just it's not an end all thing, but it does give you some information in terms of some like this guy down here, account authorizations, time to rebuild the index maybe.
Yep. So you can see the primary key of each of those tables, and just a lot of other information that may be useful to you. All right, cool. So let's move on back to process defaults. So I'm going to take a little bit deeper look at some of the other options that are available to you in this form. So we've seen it a few times, but if it's not been made clear enough, I just want to kind of give you some more context about the process defaults form and what it is. So basically, process defaults are settings that you as system administrators or users of the system can make to control various aspects of how the system responds to user commands and actions. The process defaults form, it's used to activate these process defaults and set their default values. And then you can, of course, use this form to see which of these process defaults are maybe already currently active on the system. As we've already seen before in our audit log example, many of these process defaults act as kind of on-off switches, either enabling or disabling certain system features or behaviors. Typically, those are indicated with values of 1 or 0. We can see several here in the screenshot to turn those things on and off. So not all of them behave that way, which we're going to take a look at a few of these that do not. These process defaults are global settings. That is, they operate whenever and wherever in the system that the condition for their operation exists. This means, among other things, that a process default setting applies to all sites in a database. So when you open this form for the first time, you will have already noticed during some of the demonstrations I performed that there are already several records available to you that you don't even have to set up, just turn on or off. However, you do have the ability to add new options to this list, and the full list of available process default settings can be viewed in a form called process default names. So I'm going to open that form up and we can take a look and see about what are the available options in here. So I've got about 18 that are available to me right off the bat. I didn't even do anything in this form. And I am going to look at the process default names form, and we can see clearly that there are more than 18 options available to us. Looks like there's about 44 here in this list. So today I just wanted to highlight kind of a few that you may find most useful. We've already gone into some extensive coverage of enabling audit logging, pretty simple setting to turn on or off. But a few others of note. First is going to be allow saving form runtime changes. This process default basically, if it's not quite clear here, but what it essentially does is allows your users the ability to save changes on forms or not. So this is kind of a global option to allow people to save. If this is turned off, then nobody's going to be able to save any changes to forms. So this is turned on by default, as we can see here with the default value of 1. So just want to shed some light on that one first.
And that one can be useful. I mean, when you get patch upgrades, patch updates, things like that, or, uplifts, you got to run form sync, and mostly that's, fine. Or if you did some personalizations on forms for the whole company, and then someone goes and, creates a user version for themselves, and then you change the site version, you've got to kind of manage that. I'm going to go on mute for a second.
Right. So what Tim was going for is definitely just limiting your user's ability to make changes if you are yourself maybe making some changes on a system-wide scale, or maybe specifically to a form, and you want to kind of just turn off the ability to make any changes to just help push your change through. And once that's completed, you can then come back and turn this thing on. So that's a really good example of kind of a real world scenario for how and why you would maybe want to change the default value of this particular record. Next, I'd like to talk about the WinStudio Max record cap. So this kind of plays into system performance and making sure we're running the system kind of as quickly and as efficiently as we can. The big thing is limiting the number of rows that users can return from the database at a time. You may be most familiar with this setting in user preferences. This particular process default is kind of the global option that you have to set. So it basically sets the system-wide maximum number record cap. Users can still go into their user preferences window and set their desired record cap, but whatever option they set is not going to be able to exceed this WinStudio Max record cap value that you define here. So if you set the global cap to be, I don't want anybody retrieving more than 1,000 records, and somebody tries to go into their user preferences and say, well, I want to get every single record that's available in this table. I'm not going to be able to do that. This process default global option will prevent that action from taking place, which is just going to improve system performance for most of these forms, because you're not going to allow a user to, return or request for these large sets of data to be returned. And then, oh, why is my system running slow? This thing, it's trying to open and it's not pulling in fast enough. Well, if they're trying to return, 100,000 records, it's pretty obvious that performance is going to degrade. All right. Some of the kind of interesting options in here, not ones that I've personally used, but was very interesting to learn more about, is the inactive threshold, which is, I don't think, a option in here that is by default. So you would actually need to come in here and insert this record into the process defaults form to enable the use of this particular process default option. And this user inactivity threshold basically specifies the number of days of inactivity to allow a user account before it's disabled by the system. So if you have a user account out there, somebody hasn't logged in for over 30 days, or whatever your value that you set, you can set to 30 days, 7 days. You would set this process default up and then define that number of days here. And then once that session, once that user profile or account reaches that threshold, their account would then be disabled, and they would have to contact you or another system administrator to have their account access restored. So that's an interesting option that you have here. Similarly related is two options that kind of work hand in hand, and they are the client minutes to ping session and the minutes to close orphan sessions. So I'm going to find those here in the list. So this one here, ID number 38 and 39. Funny enough, they are located right next to each other. So the minutes to close orphan sessions option specifies the number of minutes after a session has been pinged by the client can remain open after it has become unresponsive. And you define that minutes to ping session with this other process defaults. That's why they kind of go hand in hand. So if you define, I want to ping these clients every 5 minutes and see if there's been something happened, if their session got orphaned, we want to check on that. And once they have then met that threshold that you define on the minutes to close orphan sessions, then we would terminate that session. Logically, that's the way that this should work. Now, I would like to note that it's important to distinguish between inactive and orphan sessions. An unresponsive or orphan session is different from a session where the user is simply inactive. They're not doing anything in the system that has registered that they are actively performing a task or running a report or retrieving data, what have you. Some examples of an unresponsive session would be there could be network problems such as a loss of connection maybe to the IDO runtime service. You could be experiencing problems with your domain controller, or simply the computer restarted, the user was logged into the client, computer froze, closed the client out improperly instead of signing out. That sort of thing is going to cause an orphan session. So just important to note the distinction between those two.
Yeah, thanks. So are you aware of any distinction between how that works with a web client or the smart client?
Web client or smart client?
In terms of the pinging or orphaning and...
Not exactly. I'm not sure if it works any different in cloud or multi-tenant SaaS as it would in on-premise. I do not believe so, but that is an interesting thing to look into a little more.
Yeah, I don't either. And I think it's probably less the actual, whether it's, multi-tenant, the client itself, because you've got, a browser by its nature is just kind of sitting there, right? Stateless. And I suppose the smart client is too. We'll check that out and kind of find some answer on that. But yeah, this was something that got me in terms of, we always get a question like, how can I log somebody out who hasn't done anything in an hour? And based on this, it's not necessarily possible. That inactive is really more kind of, days they haven't done a transaction and things like that. I used to think I could put a number of minutes in there to be inactive, but that wasn't it. So we will find out on the smart client or web client on that.
Yep. Thanks, Tim. Are there any other questions maybe that we can go over? Looks like we're kind of bumping up against the top of the hour here. Got about 6 minutes left. So any questions that we may have would be a good time to go ahead and take a look and answer some of those. If not, I can use the remaining time to give you kind of a preview or a high-level overview of some of the tools that you do have available to you on the server side outside of the client. So let me know, Heather, if we got anything out there.
Tim just asked the questions that have come in the last few minutes, and nothing new has come in, so it might be good to do the preview and we can interject if more questions come in the meantime.
All right, perfect. So we'll just take these last few minutes here to look at some of these server tools. Again, if you have access to your app server, if you're in an on-premise or a hosted system. So we have about 3 main tools available to us. If you've done an install, some of these may be very familiar to you. A lot of times they're kind of set it and forget it. So just wanted to kind of go over these things. First one being the configuration manager. This particular utility is basically how you see which clients you have available to log into. It tells SyteLine which databases to connect to. You set up some information like your server, the database name, the forms database you're pointing to. If you are in a version that is not one database, I think that would be anything that's probably maybe 9 and under, where you still have that kind of that multi-database setup with the separate forms and objects. This tool would be where you define that forms database or that objects database, whereas in 10, it's all the same database, so there would be no change here to the database names. Some of the cooler stuff you can do in here is basically change the group configurations that you see whenever you click a drop down. If your users are not using a workstation login, then they would have to choose their configuration they're logging into, and via the configuration manager you can limit or increase the number of available configurations in that list. One of the other kind of neat things you can do is kind of tailor the application to display maybe some company specific logos. If you wanted to make your clients reflect your business a little better, you can make some changes in here via this utility. Come in here, change things like the wallpaper, the splash image. Those are all done via this utility. There are also some utilities available to run, such as clearing out the server IDO cache, a useful tool if you're doing any development and you need to have these changes reflected if you've done any audio editing. Again, it's kind of going down a little bit different path in administration, more the development side, but that utility is also useful for just kind of cleaning up some stuff that's maybe running a little awry with the IDO. So you do have that available to you. Next would be the service configuration manager. This is where when you first do an install, you would define the configurations that your Taskman service actually is listening to. So if you don't have a configuration listed in here, you have everything else set up, you're never going to have your reports run because the Taskman service is just not actively listening to that particular configuration. So this again is something that you would set up during an initial install and probably not have to make any changes to. But if you weren't aware, this is the tool that you use for that. Also, the event service, any configuration where you're running events would need to be listed under that tab. And lastly, Form Sync, another good development tool, but also one that you would use anytime you're doing maybe uplifts or APARs that you're applying and you needed to kind of sync some changes between forms. If you do have multiple configurations, let's say, for instance, you had two clients, you have the changes in one and you need to port them over to the other. You could use Form Sync to sync those forms between those two particular configurations. You also do have some other utilities available to you for actually scripting out forms and such. Again, I emphasize the fact that this is definitely going to be more used on the development side of things, but did just want to kind of show you real quick what this form is and what it does for you. And with that, I think we are pretty much at the end of the road here. So I appreciate everybody's time and attention today. If you do have any questions about anything we covered, you want to get that copy of recommended background tasks to have set up and running in your system, or if you're interested in more information about the Output Manager, feel free to contact us here. And with that, I'm done. Heather, if you got anything else to close with, I will let you take it away.
Thanks, Jesse. That pretty much covered everything. Thanks. It's like a one-stop shop. I love it. So just like Jesse said, if you have any other questions or thoughts, any other ideas for future sessions or questions from today's session, please feel free to reach out to us at info@aitbusiness.com, and we'll be happy to help. And with that, thanks so much for your time. We're glad that you can join us, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for part 2. Have a great afternoon and take care, everyone.